Good morning, delegates. Please take your seats and we start. We gave you some 10 minutes before we could resume the meeting. I hope you had a bit of a break and you've come back recharged, ready for us to now proceed. This week, of course, is going to be a little intense, and I think that rest was purposely programmed. So, dear delegates, good morning. Before we begin our deliberations today, we would like to acknowledge that today is the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. As you know, during the past week, we have seen good progress on the work of the working group and seen much progress, and we would like to commend delegates and our colleagues for their effort and dedication. We have had more convergence on many key issues than divergence, and we are confident that we are on the right track as we advance the development of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Dear delegates, we are convening this plenary for two purposes. First, we will hear a report back from the co-leads of the Informal Co-Chairs Advisory Group established under Agenda Item 5 on Digital Sequence Information, or DSI, on genetic resources, which has been advancing the work on this item in the time between the first and the second parts of our meeting. We will then undertake a first reading of the updated pre-session document CBD-Live/WG2020-3/4 and the elements of its recommendation for its initial feedback. Second, we will take stock of the progress of our work under Agenda Item 4 on the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. We will hear reports back from the co-leads of the 4 contact groups under this item. Dear delegates, we had planned to have, under Agenda Item 4, a first reading of the revised draft decision for adoption at COP15 today, to hear your initial feedback on this matter. However, we have postponed this to a later date based on the discussion at the Bureau this morning and the concerns of parties to continue with the negotiations on the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. So please take note of that change. If there are some delegates who might have programmed to come in the afternoon for Contact Group 3, please make your way to the venue. After we suspend this plenary today, we will move immediately into Contact Group 3 on targets 9 to 13. That's what I was saying earlier. So, although you have seen earlier that it is in the afternoon, we are anticipating that we are going to have time, and therefore, after we have closed this and then go straight, so that we try to make the best use of time that is available. Dear delegates, it is a challenging, the meeting is challenging in terms of trying to get the best use of it. So you are going to be seeing, perhaps as time goes on, this kind of adjustments, and we will beg you to bear with us because we really want to get the best outcome from this meeting. Before we begin, we would like to now invite the Secretariat to provide us with some logistical information for the meeting. Secretariat.
Thank you, Co-Chair. Good morning, everyone. I hope you had a nice day off yesterday. Just a kind reminder, due to COVID-19 pandemic, all in-person delegates are required to be vaccinated and to self-administer a rapid antigen test every morning before proceeding to the venue. A negative test result must be shown to access the venue. Inside the venue, delegates are required to wear face masks at all times, except when directly addressing the meeting or when eating or drinking in the restaurant areas. You will recall that we have also endeavored to provide for social distancing and to avoid overcrowding. Accordingly, the total number of delegates allowed in the venue at any one time is limited, and for these reasons, the green and yellow badges, secondary badges, are required, in addition to the conference badge. Both give access to the venue, but the green pass is needed to access this plenary hall when the plenary is in session, and also to plan the contact groups convened under the open-ended working group on the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. The proceedings of the plenary are also relayed to Hall D, where delegates can follow on the screen. So we kindly ask you to also avoid overcrowding in SBI and SAPSA contact groups, and we count on your cooperation in this respect. The proceedings of all plenary and contact group sessions can also be followed online using the virtual platform Interactio in viewer mode by all registered delegates. Access is provided via the meeting calendar using the credentials provided by your priority pass. Rooms are reserved for daily meetings of regional groups between 8 and 10 a.m. The rooms are set up with Interactio, providing for hybrid format. Parties can join their respective regional meetings remotely through the resumed meetings calendar. The CBD registration system has been configured to ensure delegates' login credentials will connect to their respective regional meetings only. A few parties for which travel of representatives to Geneva was not possible or are present here in Geneva but have tested positive for COVID have access to the full interactive virtual participation, and this has been enabled for them following a special request to the Secretariat. These participants have been contacted directly to facilitate their participation, and you can reach out to the Secretariat if you need more information. Now, turning to the use of microphones here in the room, when the chair opens the floor for interventions, if you wish to speak, please press the button in front of you only once. We will be notified of your request, and you will be entered in a queue visible to the chair. Please note that pressing the button twice will cancel your request to speak. When the chair gives you the floor, the light on your microphone will turn red. Please start speaking only once the light comes on. Please remove your earphone, speak close to the microphone, slowly and clearly, so that our dedicated team of interpreters can provide a clear translation. Some observer delegates who request the floor may not be identified by their organization name. In this case, when your microphone is on, please be sure to identify your organization before commencing your intervention. Statements on each agenda item from parties and observers will be limited to 6 minutes on behalf of regions, 3 minutes for individual parties, and 3 minutes for major groups, and 2 minutes for observers, as time allows. The time for statements is limited. A clock is provided for you on the screen to help you manage your time. But please do not speed up your reading. Rather, when speaking, please pause between sentences to make it easier for interpreters and all delegates to follow you. For statements made in plenary, delegates are requested to upload their statements using the online application on the meeting page. It greatly facilitates the work of the interpreters if you can upload your statements in advance of delivery. However, they will only be posted on the website after delivery. In any case, statements must be posted 2 hours after the end of the session that they are made in. Please be sure to include the name of your country, organization, and the agenda item on the first page of the document that is uploaded. Uploading instructions were included in your priority pass email along with your dedicated link, which leads you directly to the upload page. You can also use the number on your badge right here. Finally, parties and observers are invited to make use of the virtual display table to share publications, information materials, and events that relate to the issues being addressed by the meeting. To consult these announcements and for information on how to submit an announcement, click on the tab Virtual Display Table located on the right-hand side of the web portal of these meetings. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Secretariat. Dear delegates, we will now turn our attention to the first item for today, and that is on item 5 on DSI. I will briefly introduce it and then invite our chairs that have been handling that. Dear delegates, let us now turn to agenda item 5 on DSI on genetic resources. You will recall that we considered this item during the first part of our meeting in August last year. The outcomes of those discussions are reflected in the report of the first part of our meeting, particularly in Annex 5 to the report. As a result of those discussions, delegates, we established informal co-chairs advisory group led by Ms. Letitia from South Africa and Gaute from Norway. This group has been working in the time between the first and the second parts of our meeting, advancing several areas of work on DSI. The co-leads prepared a report of the work of the informal advisory group, which you can find as document CBD-WG2020-3/INF/8. We would now like to invite the co-leads of the informal advisory group to introduce the report. I now give the floor to the co-leads. You have the floor. Letitia, you have the floor. South Africa, you have the floor. Sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. I was waiting for the mic to turn red. And greetings to all. On behalf of my co-lead, Mr. Gaute von Hansen, I am happy to present the key points of the work of the Informal Co-Chairs Advisory Group. As you will recall, the advisory group was established to provide advice and feedback to the co-chairs and the executive secretary in preparation for the second part of the third meeting of the open-ended working group. The terms of reference for the advisory group were set out in the appendix to Annex 5 of the report of part 1 of this meeting. According to these terms of reference, the group was to provide advice on 3 elements. The first element on the undertaking of an assessment of consequences of possible policy approaches, options or modalities for benefit sharing arising from the utilization of DSI. The second element on areas of potential convergence and apparent divergence. And the last element on areas of additional work on DSI that may be needed for the period leading to COP15. The group was to also consider studies, dialogues, and views from formal and informal activities related to DSI. To undertake this work, the advisory group met 5 times, in total over an 8-week period, including an initial kick-off meeting on logistics and the work plan for the group. As you mentioned, Mr. Co-Chair, our report can be found in document CBD/WG2020-3, 2020-INF/8. Section 2 of this document summarizes the outcomes of the group. These outcomes are presented in two subsections. The first subsection addresses the framework for the assessment of policy options related to access and benefit sharing in respect of DSI. As indicated there, it is the advice of the advisory group that a step-by-step approach should be followed to help parties to gradually narrow down the possible DSI options and identify the element necessary to move the discussion forwards. Equally important is that along the way, assumptions and limitations are made explicit, reflecting the different understandings of key concepts, such as what constitutes an appropriate approach or a modality, for example. A key part of the proposed step-by-step approach would be to undertake a multi-criteria analysis to guide the development of an analytical framework for an initial assessment of different DSI policy options. A multi-criteria analysis can accommodate the complexity that DSI presents for policy options, and both qualitative and quantitative costs and benefits can be considered. Multi-criteria analysis uses predetermined criteria to assess and rank policy options according to their strengths and weaknesses, and it provides a systematic way for decision makers to assess the trade-offs of each. A key feature of the multi-criteria analysis is the performance matrix to assess policy options against the criteria. For DSI, a performance metric has been developed based on elements from the first part of the third meeting of the working group, Annexes 2 and 3 of document CBD-Live/WG2020-3/4 and submission received following part 1 of this meeting. The performance metric on policy options for DSI can be found in section 2A, part 6 of our report. Details on the different policy options are set out in section 2A, part 1, while a description of the criteria is provided in section 2A, part 5. This information is also contained in the annexes to document WG2020-3/4 add 1. Turning to section 2, subsection B of our report contains our summary of the advisory group's discussion on areas of potential convergence and apparent divergence. The summary was not negotiated by the advisory group, rather, it represents the co-lead's understanding of the main views expressed during the discussions on convergence and divergence. The summary contains 12 elements, 7 of which are areas of convergence, 2 are areas of divergence, and 3 are areas where there were aspects of both convergence and divergence. Each element is developed in the report according to the discussion of the group on that topic. Finally, section 3 of our report contains our conclusions and potential elements of a recommendation. Amongst other things, this section addresses the third element of our mandate, namely areas for further work prior to COP15. Here we again propose that a step-by-step approach be followed. We also suggest that a multi-criteria analysis of policy options be undertaken and that the Informal Coaches Advisory Group continue its work going forward to the COP15. Let me conclude, Mr. Co-Chair, by thanking my co-lead in this process, as well as the members of the Informal Advisory Group. As you can see, we did a lot of work in a short period of time, and I wish to express my appreciation for their constructive contribution and commitments to the process. Thank you very much.
Thank you, colleagues, for that update. Dear delegates, let us now turn our attention to the next matter. Thank you, colleagues, for this presentation, and congratulations on the work that you have been able to do with this advisory group. Colleagues, we would now like to recall the commitment we made in Decision 1420. In that decision, the parties committed to working towards resolving the divergence of views regarding benefit sharing arising from the use of DSI on genetic resources. We should keep that commitment in mind as we undertake our deliberations over the coming days. Turning to the documents for this item, on this basis of the colleagues' report on the work of the Informal Co-Chairs Advisory Group, the Executive Secretary prepared a document CBD-WG2020-3/4/1. This document complements document CBD-WG2020-3/4 on DSI that we considered during the first part of our meeting last year. The addendum summarizes the processes and outcomes of the Informal Co-Chairs Advisory Group on DSI, which the colleagues just presented. In addition, Section 3 of the addendum contains elements of a recommendation, which we would like to invite you to comment on now. I think we can all agree that the Informal Co-Chairs Advisory Group advanced the work on DSI during the intersessional period since the first part of this meeting. We therefore suggest we use the addendum document and its element of a recommendation as the basis of work here. You are, of course, delegates, also free to draw upon the elements contained in Annex 5 of the report of the first part of the working group meeting. As the addendum document is new for this second part of our meeting, we believe it would be useful to hear your thoughts and reflections on this document, in particular the elements of a recommendation. We would like to open the floor for a round of interventions. Dear delegates, would now like to open the floor for intervention on agenda item 5. We will start with the regional groups, followed by parties, other governments, and observers. We encourage you to keep your statements short and concise. We also suggest that statements should not focus on thanking the co-chairs, co-leads, or secretariat for the work that we have done, but rather go straight to your comments and reflections on the addendum. We will now move to invite interventions from regions.
Why go Namibia, Argentina?
Okay, so I have the following who have requested the floor: Namibia, Argentina, and Sri Lanka. Namibia, you have the floor.
Thank you, Co-Chair. Namibia speaks on behalf of Africa. Africa is of the view that a global biodiversity framework without a solution for DSI benefit sharing would not be fit for purpose. We will therefore not support adoption of the GBF until this matter is resolved. Co-Chair, Africa understands that the term digital sequence information on genetic resources is a placeholder, which does not currently have an internationally agreed meaning. We have heard some negotiating partners argue that no agreement on DSI benefit sharing is possible until there's an agreed definition. We are alarmed that this delaying tactic jeopardizes the success of COP15 while also holding back several other important international processes, including at the World Health Organization, the Plant Treaty, and the FAO Commission on Genetic Resources. Africa favors a practical and pragmatic way forward based on the third objective of the Convention. Whatever DSI is or is not, there can be no doubt that it fundamentally arises from the utilization of genetic resources and is subsequently used for the further utilization of genetic resources. In this understanding, DSI is simply a tool, or rather a rapidly evolving set of related tools employed for the utilization of genetic resources. We have therefore proposed a solution that revolves around utilization in general, rather than focusing on any specific tool. Co-Chair, Africa considers that the global community has not stopped biodiversity loss over the last 30 years, largely because it has not effectively implemented the 3 pillars of the CBD in an integrated, holistic, and mutually supportive manner. We will never achieve the long-term conservation outcomes we want unless and until we share sufficient benefits to create compelling incentives for sustainable use. Likewise, Africa is of the view that the failure to achieve the Aichi targets was largely due to insufficient resource mobilization, and judging by the slow progress in our current discussions about resource mobilization, we are afraid that the same fate could befall the GBF. We have therefore proposed a DSI solution that would mobilize significant financial resources to support sustainable use and conservation of biodiversity. The African proposal to resolve the DSI benefit sharing issue is to create a global multilateral benefit sharing mechanism under the Convention, not just under Article 10 of the Nagoya Protocol, that would collect 1% of the retail price of all biodiversity-related products sold in developed countries and use this income to support on-the-ground conservation by IPLCs and other resource custodians. We believe that such a mechanism would support all 4 of the principles contained in the emerging consensus on DSI, namely that the benefits of utilization must be shared fairly and equitably, that access to genetic data in public databases must remain open and free, that IPLCs and other resource custodians should be the main beneficiaries, and that capacity building and technology transfer for developing countries providing genetic resources are important parts of any solution. Co-Chair, Africa disagrees that the respective COP14 mandates on DSI and on the work of the open-ended working group would preclude us from including DSI in the draft GBF that will be sent to COP15 for adoption. Yes, we have clearly to make a recommendation to COP about how to deal with DSI in the context of the Global Biodiversity Framework. But we also have to consider new and emerging technologies in our design of the GBF. Africa therefore insists on retaining the language on DSI that it has inserted into the first draft of the GBF. Regarding the draft recommendations contained in document WG2020-3/2/4/add1, we are disappointed by the limited ambition and lack of transformative thinking displayed on this matter. We nevertheless stand ready to work with all parties on an ambitious, transformative, simple and effective solution to the DSI issue that would enable us all to rally behind the adoption of the GBF in Kunming, mobilize significant monetary resources for the implementation of the GBF, and set us on course to live in harmony with nature by 2050. We have submitted our suggestions for changes to the recommendation in writing. Thank you, Co-Chair.
Thank you, Namibia, on behalf of Africa. Next is Sri Lanka.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. Sri Lanka would like to make a statement on behalf of the members of the Asia and Pacific region. The Asia and Pacific region recognizes the importance of the decision on DSI made at Sharm el-Sheikh. The region would like to thank the Secretariat, the co-chairs, and members of the Informal Co-Chairs Advisory Group for facilitating the understanding on this complex issue under the guidance of the COP. Whilst it has been quite helpful, we as a region is yet to understand following remaining challenges on DSI: definition and scope, technical and scientific implications, legal viability at both the national and international level, possible implementation through a workable mechanism, interrelated challenges on factors above, different levels of understanding amongst member countries, need for more involvement of and dialogue among stakeholders, including scientific community, entrepreneurs, business communities, and IPLC, amongst others. The countries in the region are both a provider and a user of genetic resources. Therefore, the issue of DSI is important for the region. Co-chair, we have worked together over the past years and with this strenuous effort to promote the implementation of the third objective of the Convention and to achieve the minimum level of justice and equity in access and use of genetic resources taking into consideration Nagoya Protocol. While we appreciate that a series of webinars on DSI and information on it was provided for all parties, it was a challenge for many countries to translate that into national actions due to capacity and financial constraints. The concept of DSI remains largely unclear for many parties. We therefore would prefer to see strengthening of the knowledge, capacity, information, and resources on DSI. Considering multiple consequences of decisions on DSI at this stage, the region requests that the decisions may be taken after due consideration. The region has one voice on this. As such, the suggestion from Asia and Pacific region is as follows: foster comprehension of all relevant issues without hastily arriving at a conclusion which could have unintended consequences. Involve all relevant stakeholders, including scientific and business communities, IPLC, among others. The issue of DSI and how it relates to access and benefit sharing of genetic resources is essential. However, it is still at an infant stage. What may be needed now is not to be hasty and drastic in operation, but to develop a constructive dialogue on how to make ABS into a more workable mechanism. In conclusion, the Asia and Pacific region would like to reiterate its wishes to find an appropriate and implementable way forward on access and benefit sharing of genetic resources once above issues are resolved amicably. Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair.
Thank you, Sri Lanka. On behalf of Asia Pacific region, I'll now give the floor to EU, followed by Argentina. EU.
Thank you, co-lead, and good morning, colleagues. The EU and its member states would like to reaffirm that the DSI discussions have of broad relevance in the context of the ongoing negotiations of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. We look forward to further constructive exchanges on this complex, outstanding issue at our meeting this week. We express our appreciation for the work done on DSI in the intersessional period, including the work done by the co-leads of the DSI Contact Group and the Informal Advisory Group on DSI. We take note of the report of the co-leads summarizing this work as contained in document CBD/WG2020-3/4 at 1. We also take note of the elements of a draft recommendation suggested by the co-leads and acknowledge that further work and discussion on such element is needed. Co-leads, despite all the valuable efforts undertaken so far, the exploration of possible options for dealing with DSI is still at the preliminary stage. The discussions at the virtual session of the Open-Ended Working Group 3 highlighted that a solid assessment of the policy options still needs to be carried out before parties can take a decision on the issue of DSI. We also would like to point out that the policy options under scrutiny are not very detailed or are only very generally described. Many issues and aspects related to the options remain to be clarified. The EU and its member states would like to reiterate the need to deepen the analysis of the option and appreciate in that context the multi-criteria analysis framework and matrix for the assessment of DSI policy options as discussed by the IIG and presented in section 2.A and in Annex 3 of the addendum. We see a merit in having a common criteria for all parties and stakeholders to evaluate DSI policy options. And in our view, this exercise should be further supported and complemented by the contribution of independent experts external to the negotiations. Such an expert could provide an independent assessment of the option as a basis for a more informed discussion among parties. In our view, such an assessment should be ready by COP15 and might support parties in identifying the suitable and promising approaches and/or modalities for dealing with DSI. A well-defined, transparent and realistic roadmap of the work until COP15, ensuring broad stakeholder involvement, including IPLCs, academia, as well as representatives from the private sector and from the databases that hold DSI, is important for facilitating further discussions among the parties. While taking note of the additional areas of work and being supportive of the step-by-step approach as proposed by the co-leads, we regret that a clear timeline and a roadmap of the steps is missing and needs to be elaborated before we leave Geneva. Concerning the process of further analysis of the options and consultations of parties and stakeholders, we would welcome further clarification about the work that the external expert will do and a timeline of the outcomes expected. Additional information on consultation with small parties and stakeholders, as mentioned in section 2B of the addendum, would also be appreciated. We welcome the proposal by the co-lead of the contact group to extend the mandate of the IIG. In the case this is supported by the Open-Ended Working Group, a clear timeline and plan of work will also be necessary to ensure that the IIG will be able to finish its mandate. We also wish to reiterate that this informal group's main scope is to support and provide advice to the co-chairs and the executive secretary with regard to the work on DSI, and it's certainly not to be seen as a separate negotiation and discussion forum. We would like to call again for a better balanced representations of stakeholders in the IIG, namely by integrating, in addition to the ones that are already there, academia, research and development and private sector, as well as members representing databases, in order to ensure an inclusive and balanced process. Additionally, it is important that other groups such as youth are participating as well. Considering the policy options on the table, we recall our previously shared position on core elements for any potential solutions on DSI that remains valid. We are especially interested to explore further policy options that preserve an open access, that are based on a multilateral approach for DSI, and certainly support the idea of including capacity building as an integral part of any such solution. We hope that the inputs provided can contribute to the further process with the work in this critical issue at the resumed session of Open-Ended Working Group 3 and in view of COP15. Having said that, co-chairs, we have a good number of detailed comments on the documents that we will provide to you in writing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, EU, and thank you for keeping within the time. I will now give the floor to Argentina.
Thank you, Co-Chair. I will make this statement on behalf of GRULAC. GRULAC thanks the work done by the Secretariat, the Ad Hoc Technical Expert Group, and the Informal Co-Chairs Advisory Group on DSI during this process. The Latin American and the Caribbean region recalls the sovereign rights of countries over their natural resources, including genetic resources, and acknowledges the intrinsic relationship between digital sequence information and genetic resources. We recognize as a principle that any benefits from the use of digital sequence information or genetic resources should be shared in a fair and equitable way. Moreover, we find appropriate the key points of potential convergence that may lead to higher level criteria or principles reflected in paragraph 18, items B, C, and D of the document CBD/Working Group 2020/3/4/add1. We also acknowledge the existing and intrinsic relationship between genetic resources and traditional knowledge. Therefore, we believe that digital sequence information on genetic resources should be part of the deliberations related with the application and implementation of Article 8J of the Convention. Regarding subparagraph D, we would like to highlight that technology transfer must be jointly addressed with capacity building, scientific cooperation, and new resource mobilization as an integral part of the solution on digital sequence information on genetic resources. On that point, we are convinced that actions must be implemented now to reduce the existing gap among developed and developing countries. This would significantly aid to move forward the ongoing discussions and would help us to reach a common agreement on how to address DSI on genetic resources in the context of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Even if we understand that some additional challenges may exist for the assessment of the hybrid policy options in the multi-criteria analysis through the performance metrics, it is essential for the GRULAC to consider these hybrid options. Therefore, it is of relevance for us to evaluate other methodologies and tools to assess these options and not to leave them behind. Also, national experiences with ABS legislation that recognize DSI should be strongly taken into consideration. Finally, we agree on the step-by-step approach proposed to address DSI. Additionally, we understand that including DSI into the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework would optimistically aid to enhance the implementation of the third objective of the Convention, which is currently underestimated, and will contribute to the success of the GBF. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Argentina. On behalf of GRULAC, dear delegates, I do not see any further requests from other regions, so I'll now move the intervention to parties. You have 3 minutes, please, 3. Try to work within that because we are trying to make sure that we can start today working on contact group on that agenda item 913. So I'll now give the floor to Turkey, followed by Sudan. Turkey.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. Since this is the first time for Turkey taking the floor for this session, we would like to thank the Secretariat for the preparation of the documents and Ad Hoc Technical Expert Group for the hard work and efforts to make the scope and concept of DSI much more clear than before. As Turkey, we support handling DSI as an intrinsic part of genetic resources. Being aware of the importance of DSI in every aspect, we deeply consider that it is necessary to take measures for access and benefit sharing, and taking into account scientific research at the same time in balance. Turkey would like to underline the significance of the traceability of DSI to ensure fair and equitable benefit sharing. Disclosure of origin is a fundamental component of DSI that should not be disregarded to make ABS issues proceed fairly and equitably. This is also essential for intellectual property rights. Additionally, facilitating addressing the country passport data could be important and valuable for traceability. In terms of policy options, they should be more detailed in terms of modalities. Option 2, which there is no pick but standard math, can be applicable and acceptable only if the tagging of country of origin is done in databases. My delegation would like to emphasize that the linkage between DSI and country of origin should be preserved for downstream monitoring. Turkey is looking forward to an international consensus on this issue under the Convention. We request the Secretariat this statement to be included in the report of the meeting. Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair.
Thank you, Taki. For purposes of helping delegates to prepare, let me first give you the lineup, which I have here. I have Sudan, Mexico, Jordan, South Africa, New Zealand, Brazil, Saudi Arabia. Then online, we have Belarus and Bolivia. So now I'll give the floor to Sudan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sudan supports the statement made by Namibia on behalf of Africa, and that is that we cannot support the GBF 2020 before we had completed the discussion on the DSI, and that in order for us to reach a methodology for access and benefits sharing concerning DSIs on genetic resources, and that in a fair and equitable manner. Because the utilization of DSI is an integral part of the utilization of genetic resources and traditional knowledge associated with it, and that would also be associated with the sustainable use of biodiversity and its conservation. We'd also like to underline that it is extremely important to ensure technology transfer and capacity building as part of the solutions related to digital sequencing information. I thank you, sir.
Thank you, Sudan. Mexico, you have the floor, followed by Jordan.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Chair, thank you very much. Mexico supports the position expressed by GRULAC. We consider that it's necessary to highlight that the physical genetical resources are an intrinsic part of DSI. The great variety of these sequences not only is a reflection of biodiversity as a result of evolutionary processes, but also the continual traditional management and the knowledge associated with it and the culture of indigenous peoples and local communities who have generated this for hundreds of or thousands of years and continue to do this, where the role of women has been preponderant. We reiterate the relevance of the public policy construction with a human rights approach, where the benefits derived from the DSI will will support the common good with positive impacts on conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity, including research, innovation, and technological development. Mexico, as a pluricultural state, emphasizes the importance of working on a definition of DSI which would consider traditional knowledge associated with it as an inherent part of the concept. And in this sense, it is very essential to have policies on DSI from an inclusive point of view that characterize the full and effective participation of indigenous peoples, through the free, prior, and informed consent concept under conditions that are mutually agreed. And it's necessary, therefore, absolutely necessary, to consider alternative options to the multilateral mechanisms, such as regulatory, hybrid, or mixed systems without any detriment to the human society. We know the importance of DSI for scientific activities in the generation of basic knowledge and applied knowledge to conserve cultural biological diversity, as well as technological development. However, we are also absolutely certain that the technological community understands that today more than ever, we must attend to the ethical, environmental, and social concerns. Thank you.
Thank you, Mexico. I now give the floor to Jordan, followed by South Africa. Jordan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Co-Chair. Jordan supports the statement that we heard by the Group of Asia and the Pacific. The question of DSI is extremely important at the world level, in particular for developing countries who have the greatest swath of genetic resources. And those resources are the safety valve for the international food security, and also is the basis of much therapeutic and pharmaceutical preparations. And therefore, many countries, including Jordan, are aware of how this information can be moved through the internet without due attention to equity and equality. And therefore, we believe that addressing the DSI in an abundant manner as we treat genetic resources or the genetic material itself, and not as an integral part of the accompanying information of those resources. And therefore, our biologists in Jordan are of the opinion that DSI is only one link in the chain of primary materials, and those are the ones that also constitute parts of the DNA, especially in those areas which we have not been coded in the genetic orders and others, and believe that all of those applications could be part of an access and benefits sharing system that is equitable. In addition to all of this, the information and the applications should also cover all of the DNA chain, be that the parts that is well known or that is not known yet or under research, and also all the details and the codes of the DNA should cover all the aspects of the structure, the function of the places of the genes, and the ordering and the sequence of the DNA and the RNAs, and the smaller segments which we call the ADAs. We have worked together over the past few years, and we have made every effort in order to implement Objective 3 of the Convention, and for us to be able to attain the basic level of equity and justice in the utilization of the genetic materials, and also to agree on a mechanism that would ensure the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities in their natural resources as part of the mechanism of the Nagoya Protocol. And we found that this mechanism is legal in allowing us to reach genetic materials and to utilize it, and that any similar techniques should also include those resources in the protocol, and that the benefits that would come of that are the property of those nations and peoples, and which would enable them to live with stability. And we support the first choice in the report, in the document before us, so that we could ensure access and benefit sharing and the production of DSIs that would have a positive effect on the sustainable utilization, and that would assure equality and equity and the building of capacity for developing countries, as well as enabling the informed prior consent according to the conditions to enable those countries that have the genetic. The chair was interrupting the representative Jordan.
You summarize, but the speed, the interpreter could have choked, actually. So let's not have somebody falling in the interpretation room because of lack of oxygen. Go a little bit slow, but not too slow. Just be have the right pace. Thank you, Jordan. Now I give the floor to South Africa, followed by New Zealand.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. South Africa supports the statement made by Namibia on behalf of the African Group, and we welcome the documents prepared by the Executive Secretary and the report of the Informal Co-Chairs Advisory Group on DSI. South Africa is a mega-diverse country, and this diversity has been used over the millennia by our ancestors to generate a wealth of traditional knowledge. Knowledge for which we now have active programs entrenching certain aspects into the modern economy and deriving value from its mainstreaming. It is critical that equitable benefits from this traditional knowledge, whether from South African innovation or innovation anywhere else, are shared with our IPLCs. To that end, we must ensure that mechanisms are developed and implemented among parties to ensure that benefits derived through DSI are shared fairly and equitably. South Africa has a strong research community and effective national access and benefit sharing legislation, and is building its national system of innovation to enhance our ability to derive social and economic benefit. We thus require a DSI system that promotes easy access while ensuring fair and equitable sharing of the benefits arising from the use of DSI. In the framework of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, it is therefore essential that we find a way to ensure fair and equitable distribution of benefits from the global use of DSI, an imperative that South Africa will insist upon. It is important to note that South Africa does not consider it fair and equitable to merely derive shared capacity building related benefits from global innovations built upon DSI. Developing capacities, both for the researchers and the traditional knowledge holders and their communities, developing value chains and creating innovations, jobs, and wealth in the country of origin are as critical to us as are the actual financial benefits. South Africa supports the step-by-step approach, criteria, and performance matrix developed in the advisory group's report for assessing all policy options in the spirit of ensuring progress on DSI discussions. South Africa eagerly awaits the assessment outcomes, with particular interest in the multilateral benefit sharing system policy option. In conclusion, Mr. Co-Chair, South Africa views DSI as a critical item in these discussions, and we would want to find solutions that address both ease of access and ensuring both financial and non-financial benefits return to the originating country and their IPLCs. Mr. Co-Chair, we have made text proposals on the elements of the recommendations and have submitted them as an annex to this intervention. Thank you.
Thank you, South Africa. Now I will give the floor to New Zealand, followed by Brazil. New Zealand.
Thank you very much, Co-Chair. Aotearoa New Zealand thanks the co-leads and the participants in the Informal Advisory Group for their work on this issue. On process, New Zealand has supported ongoing discussion within the CBD on digital sequencing information, recognising its importance to a range of parties and partners for a range of reasons. It is, however, critical that the outcome of any work undertaken on digital sequencing information within the CBD remains clearly within the mandate of the CBD. We must also ensure that any COP decision does not stray into what should be a treaty action requiring formal acceptance by parties. We need to be very careful in framing a COP decision on this. It must be for parties to determine how they will manage this in a domestic setting, taking into account their particular rights and responsibilities, including to Indigenous peoples. We understand this is implicit in Subcriterion 7 in Annex 2. On substance, we consider that any outcome from our deliberations must continue to support scientific research and innovation, as is referred to in Subcriterion 4 of Annex 2. We note the importance of Subcriterion 5, that any outcome must benefit the conservation of biodiversity and its sustainable use. We acknowledge that there are different worldviews contributing to the CBD. For Maori, Species themselves have the right to share in the benefits of research and development based on genetic resources sourced from them. Benefit sharing should support biodiversity and be prioritised towards organisms the genetic resources are sourced from and their supporting ecosystems where possible. The guardianship of traditional knowledge associated with organisms genetic resources are derived from should also be prioritised for benefit sharing where possible, to support the maintenance of traditional knowledge and traditional practices. The role of Indigenous peoples and local communities and their traditional knowledge is central to their issue. Their traditional knowledge and rights must be protected. We must take into consideration the need to encourage retention of associated metadata on the provenance of digital sequencing information across the data life cycle, for example, through traditional knowledge and biocultural labels. We recommend an amendment to paragraph 5B to take that into account. Furthermore, we think paragraph 5C should refer directly to the need to give effect to the rights of Indigenous peoples. It is our view that the criteria and sub-criteria in Annex 2 do not adequately reflect the fundamental importance of this issue to Indigenous peoples and local communities, with merely one reference in sub-criterion 17 that refers to benefit sharing. We have some proposals that we will share to amend this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, New Zealand. Just on the dot of 3 minutes. The next speakers will be from Brazil, Saudi Arabia, and online will be Bolivia. So I now give the floor to Brazil.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair, and good morning. Brazil fully supports the statement delivered by Argentina on behalf of GRULAC, but we'd like to add a few additional points. The GBF provides us with a unique opportunity to address the third pillar of the Convention, which has been historically and regrettably its most neglected objective. Therefore, we believe that DSI must be an integral component of the post-2020 GBF, including as a significant contribution to resource mobilization. And it should be, the issue should be explicitly addressed with clear, action-oriented language and references to genetic resources in any form. A COP decision on DSI must also highlight the need to develop in a timely manner a practical approach to ensuring the fair and equitable sharing of the benefits arising from the use of DSI. To that end, we should welcome existing national ABS frameworks and legislation, which already contain provisions and obligations regarding the use of DSI, and acknowledge that these domestic regimes effectively contribute to addressing the issue in a practical manner. That said, we do also acknowledge the need for a balanced solution that also addresses concerns that some parties may have raised in respect of the issue. In particular, in our view, the COP decision should also recognize that any approach to addressing DSI should not prevent DSI from being accessed, nor should it unduly hamper scientific research and innovation. Recognizing that a significant number of developing country parties currently lack adequate technical and technological capacities to fully benefit from the use of DSI, we believe that for an ambitious post-2020 GBF, the COP decision in Kunming should also require developed country parties to provide support and capacity building and to facilitate the transfer to developing country parties of technologies and knowledge that may be relevant to accessing and using DSI. Finally, Mr. Co-Chair, regarding the report of the co-leads, we'd like to say that we agree with their step-by-step approach, but we should be aiming here for a relatively short walk, not a long marathon. This approach should not be used in any way to justify not having a decision on the matter in Kunming. Thank you.
Thank you, Brazil. I now give the floor to Saudi Arabia.
شكرا السيد الرئيس. إن انعقاد هذا
Mr. Chair, the holding of this session reconfirms the commitment of the international community to the ambitious goals that have been developed to achieve biodiversity, its conservation and development in order to equitably share benefits from it. That's why we have to use this opportunity, this chance, to increase our effort in the area of DSI benefit sharing for the establishment of adequate mechanism to find solutions to these important issues. For this reason, our delegation, our country, supports the results of the Sharm el-Sheikh conference for the development of DSI resources or relations in order to establish a specific mechanism to handle this information for research and innovation. Our delegation believes that the benefits coming from the use of DSI must be shared in a just and equitable way. We need to review the ways and methods for assuring equitable sharing. Our delegation stresses the importance of capacity building so that countries can use for their benefit the DSI that is at our disposal. Thank you.
Thank you, Saudi Arabia. We will be closing the request for the floor shortly. Now we are going to give the floor to Bolivia and Indonesia. They are online. Bolivia.
Thank you, Co-Chair. Bolivia supports the GRULAC statement. Bolivia considers that the utilization of DSI is the utilization of genetic resources, acknowledging the sovereign rights of countries over their natural resources. DSI must be used considering limits, which are the limits for the natural reproduction of life in Mother Earth. Mother Earth is a living being, and it is sacred. We do not see genetic materials as objects or things to be freely manipulated, more so when all possible effects in the wild are still scarcely understood. DSI is part of the sacred life of all living beings of Mother Earth, and therefore should be treated with respect and following the laws of nature, instead of the laws of human beings, if we all want to live in harmony with nature. Therefore, DSI should be carried out in the context of a rights-based approach, taking into consideration the rights of Mother Earth and the rights and full and effective participation of indigenous peoples and local communities with free, prior, and informed consent. Any possible modality for access and benefit sharing of DSI should consider, among other things, the following. DSI must be used following regulations. There must be standard terms and conditions for DSI. The respect of the rights of Mother Earth and the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities. Ensure that the socioeconomic and digital divide between developed and developing countries is not increased. Ensure the intergenerational continuity of traditional knowledge and practices associated with the use and mapping of genetic resources. Bolivia recognizes that indigenous peoples and local communities should be the primary beneficiaries of financial benefit sharing for DSI on genetic resources because of their pivotal role in conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. For this, it will be necessary guaranteeing the traceability of the genetic resources in order to accomplish benefit sharing for indigenous peoples and local communities. We need to see a solution for DSI reflected in the global biodiversity framework. If not, the framework will not be forward-looking at all, given the already prevailing inequities in DSI use. Finally, I want to mention that the provision of financial resources, technology transfer, and capacity building are relevant and necessary for addressing DSI on genetic resources, in particular in developing countries, which is a necessary condition for the use of DSI. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you, Bolivia. I'll now give the floor to Indonesia.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. First, Indonesia would like to express its appreciation to the CBD Secretariat for the preparation of the DSI document and for the AHTEG and the member of the advisory group for the hard work. The development of several groups covering the scope of DSI is very important to ensure legal clarity for the future of DSI. Indonesia understands the importance of terminology in technology development, database management, data openness, and data sharing. Nevertheless, open cannot have direct meaning and does not necessarily mean unrestricted. Good policy and management need to be formulated to reach a common understanding without halting scientific research and development. Indonesia would also like to emphasize the importance of technical and scientific cooperation, technology transfer, access to technology, and technology co-development as part of the DSI policy. This will ensure the democratization of the access and use of DSI, making it more equitable and mutual, so that each country has the capacity and opportunity to access and use DSI to its full potential. Capacity building on DSI is relevant and necessary for addressing DSI. In addition, the implementation of capacity building, including through science and technology transfer in mutual collaboration, is necessary to be enhanced and facilitated. Indonesia believes that all countries, especially high technology countries, need to fully understand that there will be no biotechnology development without biodiversity data, and vice versa, biodiversity data will lack its meaning and context without technology. DSI can only be fully utilized in combination with branches of life sciences such as genomics, proteomics, and metabolomics, which should also be a consideration in order to develop holistic policy interventions. Therefore, the definition and scope of DSI must reflect all forms of data related to biodiversity and also anticipate the future development in science and technology. Co-Chair, Indonesia also would like to stress the linkage of DSI with the Nagoya Protocol and its relation with the CBD objectives, particularly regarding the direction of potential commercial use of DSI. Benefit sharing from the use of DSI of genetic resources is necessary. Thus, the mechanism to address this is proposed to be in place. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Indonesia. Dear delegates, before I invite the next speakers, please, you are reminded to upload your statements to enable the interpreters do their work better. In fact, if you can load before you have taken the floor. Now, I have a number of requests from parties, and I'm just wondering whether our objective of trying to move to the next meeting, which was in the afternoon, can also happen before, but let's see how it goes. So these are the next speakers: Kenya, United Arab Emirates, Tajikistan, Canada, Cameroon, Malawi, and Colombia. Kenya, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. In the spirit of saving time, we shall be very brief. First point we want to make is that Kenya supports the position of the African group as articulated by Namibia. Our position is that DSI is derived from genetic resources and hence relevant to the CBD objective number 3 on access benefit sharing for both genetic resources and traditional knowledge. And finally, that the DSI should be part of the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. Thank you.
Thank you, Kenya. I now give the floor to United Arab Emirates, followed by Tajikistan.
شكرا سيد الرئيس. في البداية يدعم وفد.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First of all, our delegation, United Arab Emirates, supports Sri Lanka concerning DSI on behalf of the Asian Pacific region. In 2021, we adopted a federal law regulating the access to genetic resources and their derivative products, as well as equitable and just access to the benefits from them in order to conserve and develop traditional knowledge. Our delegation is in favor of using DSI for scientific research and the access to the information in question, which can be used by other sectors if there is a regulation that's too strict that would weaken the use of this information for increasing knowledge and a better benefit sharing. There's more and more production and use of DSI over the globe. That's why we need to include specific language in GBF in accordance with our convention, the Nagoya Protocol, and the right of indigenous peoples and local communities. The Secretariat of the Convention must continue its efforts to build capacity of member states, of parties, in order to reach the three objectives of the Convention. To conclude, the delegation of the United Arab Emirates is favorably recognizing the draft recommendations in the document contained in the document prepared by the Informal Advisory Group. We're in favor of the step-by-step approach to find the right elements to achieve this goal, in particular in paragraph 6 of the draft recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you, United Arab Emirates. Now I give the floor to Tajikistan, followed by Canada.
I thank United Arab Emirates. Tajikistan, followed by Canada, please.
Спасибо большое, господин.
I thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. Tajikistan would like to support the statements made by Brazil and a number of other countries, noting that the issue of DSI of genetic resources is a globally important issue for developing countries, and especially for countries with transition economies that are fully dependent on their sustainable use. Concerning capacity building, I believe this is the top priority issue. Tajikistan, being a party to the Nagoya Protocol, is committed to the solution to the issue of equitable access and benefit sharing. The DSI issue should find a solution on the basis of a legislative framework in order to achieve equitable use of DSI information. Thank you.
Thank you, Tajikistan. I now give the floor to Canada, followed by Cameroon. Malawi, you will come after Cameroon. So Canada, you have the floor.
Thank you, Co-Chair. As Canada was not in a position to engage actively at the virtual sessions, we would like to share our views on several general points. Canada considers that the continuing uncertainty around the scope and definition of DSI clouds our work here as well as in other fora. We welcome the ARTEG's work and consider that Group 1 offers the practical and legal clarity needed by providers and users alike. We support the ARTEG's conclusion that associated information, including traditional knowledge associated with genetic resources, does not itself comprise DSI. However, we firmly recognize the role of Indigenous peoples as stewards of biodiversity, and that we must find ways to enable and improve Indigenous involvement and participation in DSI-related research and benefit sharing. Canada is one of the major providers of DSI to global databases from Canadian genetic resources. We consider that efficient exchange of biodiversity data is critical for CBD implementation, and unduly restricting dissemination would limit the generation and sharing of benefits from utilization of genetic resources and jeopardize their efficient conservation and sustainable use, as well as food security, climate adaptations, and public health. Canada strongly supports principles of open science, while recognizing that open access requires considerations of ownership and sustainability of open access infrastructures. The UNESCO recommendation on open science is clear about the need to ensure participation in open science, capacity building to achieve it, norms that should apply, and ability to redress situations in which gaps arise. Canada recognizes the need for collaborative and constructive engagement on this challenging fountain of political, legal, and technological issues. To that end, we support the gradual step-by-step approach proposed, including continuation of the valuable work of the Informal Co-Chairs Advisory Group. We consider that the annexes describe works in progress, and that the potential policy options currently listed would be better termed archetypes, as actual options under each have yet to be outlined in sufficient detail to allow an analysis at an appropriate level for stakeholder and rights holder consultations. Canada, like many others here, considers that capacity building to access and use globally shared DSI must be a key part of any DSI solution. As that seems an area of clear convergence at this stage, we consider that the IAG and parties and observers should flesh out what DSI capacity building truly means in practice, and what kinds of platforms and tools could help achieve this shared goal. Thank you.
Thank you, Canada. Dear delegates, I still have quite a long list of parties who have requested to take the floor, and therefore try to be as succinct as possible. We want you to save time, and we still try to go and tackle the contact group meeting here. So I now have Cameroon, and that will be followed by Malawi.
Merci, Co-Chair.
I thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. Would like to support the African position expressed by Namibia. We should say that the DSI part is the least used, and this is an imperative. We're convinced concerning a conclusion that would be clear, the connection between DSI and genetic resources concerning their management. We believe that equitable benefit sharing from the sequences needs increased financing of management of sustainable use of genetic resources. This process, as far as we are concerned, concerning DSI, should establish free access of all countries to this information, especially for developing countries, within the development and the use, including access by indigenous peoples and local communities, so that we can achieve equitable access. Thank you.
Thank you, Cameroon. I'll now give the floor to Malawi.
Thank you, Chair. Malawi supports the amendments on the draft recommendations as submitted by Namibia on behalf of Africa, and would like to stress that one of the barriers we need to overcome as part of transformative change in achieving the implementation of the GBF is to address the continued disregard of DSI as a relevant component for achieving the third objective of the CBD and the GBF on a larger scale. Chair, Malawi would like to highlight the fact that not having a timely solution for DSI in the GBF may have the following 4 consequences. Number 1, countries will not have an option but to use ABS contracts to prevent users from depositing DSI into databases that do not have terms and conditions or do not make best efforts to facilitate identification of the providing country. Number two, there will be a delay in dealing with capacity and technological limitations to generate, access, and use DSI. Chair, we know that capacity to generate, access, and use DSI for conservation and sustainable use purposes is not evenly and equitably distributed, but that it is low in most provider countries. So any delay in having a solution for DSI in the GBF will also delay the opportunity for dealing with capacity and technological limitations that exist in most developing countries. Thirdly, there will be resistance by providing countries to provide their genetic resources, of which DSI is part, where mechanisms for ensuring benefit sharing are not available. Chair, it is in the interest of all countries to advance science, research, and development, but we need to resolve the lack of trust that has developed over the years between provider countries and users of genetic resources due to lack of benefit sharing, and including a solution for DSI in the GBF provides an opportunity to resolve that lack of trust that we should not delay. Finally, there will be no incentives to local communities and providers who provide genetic resources for conservation and sustainable use, which is an important component of ensuring implementation of the GBF. Chair, we urge parties to look at these potential consequences we have mentioned when moving forward with DSI in the GBF, and therefore we support the proposals made by Africa through Namibia for recommendation in paragraph 7, which provides concrete, timely, and practical solutions for dealing with DSI in the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Malawi. Before I give the floor to Colombia, I would like to read out the next list of speakers. You are still many, so please, if you can help us and be precise, concise as possible, that would be okay. Japan, Zimbabwe, UK, Norway, Kuwait, Guatemala, Republic of Korea, Iran, Australia, and Russian Federation. So those are the next 10 speakers to take the floor. I'll now give the floor to Colombia, followed by Japan.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. Colombia supports the intervention made by Argentina on behalf of GRULAC. In this sense, we believe that the document presented by Secretariat CBD-WG2020-3/4 does not have sufficient elements to allow compliance with the mandate of Decision 14/20. Therefore, Colombia considers it essential that the draft recommendation should establish clearly and directly how digital sequence information on genetic resources will be addressed in the GBF, and that this be worked on during the contact groups that will discuss this agenda item in the coming days. Likewise, Colombia highlights that in concordance with Decision 1420, the term DSI is currently used as a placeholder until an alternative term is agreed upon. Therefore, we see with concern that despite the excellent work carried out by the ad hoc group, ATEC, and the request made by several parties, including Colombia, no progress has been made in agreeing on this term, which is delaying the process for solving the divergences with respect to DSI. In this sense, Colombia considers important that this step-by-step approach that will be addressed contemplates the agreement on the accord a term that will replace DSI, as well as its scope, and that this scope has to be reflected in the ABS dispositions. Therefore, Colombia proposes to include an additional paragraph in these terms in the draft recommendation that would be made for COP15. Finally, Colombia wants to call for the DSI process not to be extended more and more. We currently have enough work and scientific evidence to continue advancing and find the best solution. Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair.
Thank you, Colombia. I will now give the floor to Japan, followed by Zimbabwe. Japan.
Thank you, Co-Chair. From the outset, Japan would like to emphasize that the discussion on access and benefit sharing of genetic resources and the matter of digital sequence information on genetic resources should be based on scientific evidence and in accordance with its own merit. The topic should be free from unnecessary politicization or packaging with other issues. Access and benefit sharing of genetic resources should sufficiently take into account the enormous non-monetary benefits on research and innovation in contributing to conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity, and should not put this at stake by treating this as a subject matter under resource mobilization. We urge that discussions stay within the bounds of the Convention and the Protocol. While Japan appreciates the work of the co-lead and the informal advisory group on the way forward, we see lack of clarity on whether and how this policy option discussion would practically contribute to resolving the divergence of views. We note that the work on policy option was not specifically mandated by COP14 under Decision 14/20. We also note that the co-lead's report does not sufficiently address the legal viability of some of the options within the framework of the Convention and the framework. The definition and the scope of the DSI, which is still a placeholder, remain unclear. As such, we think that the work from the informal advisory group could only be used for informative purposes. Co-Chair, we need to discuss and have a common understanding on the process going forward. First, it is not clear how multi-criteria analysis would help advance the assessment to the next step. The idea we heard from the co-chair, our co-lead, last year was to hire a consultant and then weigh criteria and make assessment. An update on the consultancy or expert is still needed. It is also unclear if and when cost-benefit analysis and analysis of hybrid option would ever be conducted. Second, a step-by-step approach is suggested, but it is not clear how many steps in total are envisaged and how many steps can be taken before COP15 Part 2 and for what end. Third, as regards the potential timetable for the implementation of any solution, it will depend on what kind of solution the COP may come up with. Furthermore, we should clarify the role and the mandate of the informal advisory group. In the view of my delegation, this is informal in nature, while noting the work so far. To conclude, any decision we arrive at should not negatively impact unrestricted and open access to DSI and scientific and technological development, and should not pave way toward creating a restrictive, complex, and costly modality without enhancing legal clarity and uncertainty. We urge the need to be realistic without precising and raising unrealistic expectations with regard to this complex and controversial subject matter. In this regard, my delegation fully supports the statement made by Sri Lanka. My delegation is happy to actively engage in the way forward. We will submit a textual edit to the draft resolution in writing. Thank you.
Thank you, Japan. Again, I would like to appeal to delegates to try their best not to exceed 3 minutes. In fact, if possible, just be at 2 minutes, because we are thinking so hard on how to save time. And now give the floor to Zimbabwe, followed by UK.
Thank you, Co-Chair. Zimbabwe wishes to support the Africa position on digital sequence information as presented by Namibia. A global biodiversity framework with no resolution on DSI for benefit sharing will not meet one of the key objectives of the convention, that is, fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising out of the utilization of genetic resources. To this end, Zimbabwe is not in favor of a GBF that does not address the fundamental issues on DSI benefit sharing. To achieve sustainable conservation, benefits arising from sustainable use of all forms of genetic resources must be shared. To this end, Zimbabwe has set up an ABS committee to advance this noble cause. Therefore, Zimbabwe wishes to reiterate that a global multilateral benefit sharing mechanism under the convention, and not just under the Nagoya Protocol, would ensure full benefit by all from the benefits arising from utilization of DSI. The GBF is a document that we will use in future years to encompass new and emerging technologies. Thank you, Co-Chair.
Thank you, Zimbabwe. Done well in terms of time management there. Now I give the floor to UK, followed by Norway.
Thank you, Chair. The United Kingdom is committed to working towards finding a solution to the issue of benefit sharing in relation to digital sequence information on genetic resources. The UK continues to pursue an outcome to these discussions that reflects the following 4 principles. First, that where benefits arise, they should be shared fairly and equitably. Second, that any approach must ensure that open access is maintained. Third, that any approach should not hinder research and innovation, which, as the recent pandemic has reminded us, relies on quick and ready access to DSI to tackle. And fourth, that capacity building and technology transfer should be a component of any agreed outcome. We take note of the details contained in the draft recommendation, and we look forward to discussing those in more detail during the next few days. Like a number of other parties who have spoken today, we note that there are many areas of our consideration which are still at a relatively early stage. We believe that a crucial outcome from this meeting in Geneva should be a clear roadmap which sets out a practical and realistic timeline to agreement on this politically challenging problem as quickly as possible. We look forward to working intensively to finalize this roadmap. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, UK. Again, time has been well managed there. Then I'll give the floor to Norway, followed by Kuwait. Norway.
Thank you, Chair. Norway looks forward to the discussion in the 2 sessions in the contact group. We would like to stress the need of a solution on DSI. The recommendations to the COP on DSI should be brief and build on the formal and informal work done so far, including the global dialogue on DSI hosted by South Africa and Norway. We are also of the opinion that we should build on the discussions in the Co-Chair's Informal Advisory Group that covered much ground in a short time. We agree that we need a step-by-step approach with involvement of stakeholders and that we have to narrow down on the policy options in order to move ahead. We should discuss the current policy options that are on the table. At this meeting, we need to agree on a clear roadmap towards COP15 and decide what intersessional work we need. Finally, Norway wants to point out that any solution to DSI needs to be mutually supportive with other instruments and processes and promote research, innovation, and public health. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Norway, and thank you for giving us some extra time there. Now give the floor to Kuwait, followed by Guatemala.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Kuwait supports the statement made by Asia and the Pacific regarding DSI. We see that this subject is not clear and is not understood yet. DSI needs a lot of capacity building for countries as it covers many of the political, economic, and financial aspects. Many states do not have the knowledge or the know-how as to how to elaborate plans of action regarding this issue. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Kuwait. That is even much better. And now give the floor to Guatemala, followed by Republic of Korea.
Muchas gracias.
Chair, thank you very much. Guatemala, let me say, supports the GRULAC statement. We would like to stress the intrinsic relationship between DSI and genetic resources, as well as its importance for knowledge, for appraisal, for conservation and sustainable use of biological diversity. Guatemala considers that the scientific use for academic or scientific use, non-monetary in other words, of digital DSI should have public access, and any type of restriction to this information would actually be a step backwards in terms of the progress in the knowledge of biological diversity and would therefore be a step backwards in terms of the implementation of the convention. Guatemala also considers that the use of DSI for commercial purposes or monetary purposes should be under the scope of application of the third goal of the Convention on Biological Diversity. It would be necessary to identify or to trace the origin of or possible origins of the DSI used and apply agreements for mutually agreed conditions, and where it's not possible to identify the origin, to apply multilateral benefit agreements or seek possible solutions to determine the just and equitable distribution of the benefits. Thank you.
Thank you, Guatemala. Now the floor is given to Republic of Korea, followed by Iran.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. First of all, we would like to extend our appreciation to the Informal Co-Chairs Advisory Group for their hard work. The Republic of Korea recognizes that with scientific research and innovation, the DSI can contribute to biodiversity conservation and sustainable use, human health, and sustainable development. Any approach to the DSI must hold such values. We are of the view that, in principle, the DSI does not fall into the scope of the CBD and the Nagoya Protocol, given its essential properties and how it is used. Nevertheless, we are open to further exploration on the policy options for benefit sharing in the interest of discussions. In this regard, we would like to share 3 important points to consider when we assess policy options suggested in the document at 1 and newly proposed during the future deliberation. First, the open access to the public database needs to be ensured at any case. Second, we should bear in mind in the process of the discussion of the policy options before us that they could have a possibility to conflict with the temporal scope of the CBD and the Nagoya Protocol. Third, under circumstances where the definition and the scope of the DSI have not been agreed on, evaluating pros and cons of the policy options, including through multi-criteria analysis, would be very complicated, but we should make every effort to reach a well-informed decisions best reflected such fundamental factors. The Korean delegation looks forward to a holistic and balanced approach in discussion on the policy options on DSI. Thank you.
Thank you, Republic of Korea. Dear delegates, I see that we are making really good progress in saving at least 1 minute. I wish we could maintain that. I'll now give the floor to Iran, followed by Australia. Iran, you have the floor.
Dear co-chairs, digital sequence information is an important aspect of today's biodiversity and has a major role in the topic of access and benefit sharing, especially in countries with high biodiversity. My delegation divides DSI and its related discussions into 3 broad categories. It has technical and scientific aspects, policy aspects, and legal aspects. Any decision on DSI needs detailed separate discussions in each of the 3 areas we mentioned. Although half-life of this DSI definition is very short, but we believe that much information is available in the literature with regard to technical and scientific aspects of this topic. Nevertheless, there is still much to do with regard to the definition and scope that parties could agree on, as the past meetings that had been conducted by CBD indicates. With regard to policy aspects and its underlying mechanisms, the progress is even lower and a global and regional clearance lacks in this regard. This shows that there is still much work to be done with this topic and much negotiations are needed to be done between parties and also regions. When we get to the third aspect, it as legal issues, we even see no clear mechanism and suggestion to solve many different challenges that exist in this area. National and international legislations are far from what we need as a platform on which DSI can act. Many unanswered questions exist in this regard, and the progress in this regard is the lowest, if not any, of course. Regarding these explanations, and also the fact that Iran is among biodiversity-rich countries, we cannot accept the inclusion of DSI in the current framework. This is especially the case for Iran, which is both a provider and user of genetic resources. Discussions with regard to DSI are still in its infancy, and much work needs to be done in all the above three aspects, especially in the legal one. Iran may also suggest and thinking to form a working group to analyze DSI in all its related items, as we believe it opens up a new era to the CBD and its triple objectives. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Iran. I'll now give the floor to Australia, followed by Russian Federation. Australia.
Thank you, Chair. Before my intervention, I would just like to recognise the devastating news out of China this morning of a China Eastern Airlines passenger jet that has crashed with 130 people on board. Our thoughts are with the families of all affected. Australia looks forward to constructive discussions on the important issue of digital sequence information. We recall that at COP14, parties committed to working towards the resolution of the divergence of views that exists among parties regarding benefit sharing from the use of digital sequence information on genetic resources. We welcome the effort that has been made by parties to narrow the range of outstanding areas of divergence. As reflected in the co-lead's summary, parties are agreed on a range of important considerations. The higher level criteria identified by the co-leads represent a solid foundation on which we can seek to build at these meetings. Of course, there remain several areas of divergence. These include divergences on some key foundational issues. Australia supports the intervention made by New Zealand on the need to ensure that the outputs of our discussions on this issue, including any decision at COP15, clearly respects the mandate of the CBD. As was made clear in the relevant COP14 decision, the discussions that we have been having on these issues to date have been without prejudice to the circumstances in which Article 15.7 applies. In our view, several of the policy options proposed would require treaty amendments or the negotiation of a new international agreement. We also observe that some uncertainty remains about the proposed step-by-step approach. In particular, we have questions about the proposal for further analysis of policy options, including who would undertake the analysis, what opportunities there would be for party involvement, how the proposed criteria would be weighted, when and how cost-benefit considerations would be factored in, and when the outputs of any analysis would be available. The resolution of these issues will be important to the development of a clear path forward. In the interest of time, we won't repeat here our views on the substantive issues for discussion, but refer delegates to the statement we made at the first part of this meeting. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Australia, and thank you for bringing to us that news concerning that flight, which has unfortunately resulted in the loss of so many lives. Our thoughts are with the families and the Chinese people. Now, I'll give the floor to the Russian Federation, but before doing that, let me read out the next 10 lists of speakers from parties: Ecuador, Switzerland, Algeria, Uganda, Egypt, Argentina, Belarus, DR Congo, Israel, and Tanzania. So immediately after Russian Federation, it will be Ecuador. So I now give the floor to the Russian Federation.
Distinguished Mr. Chairman, we thank the co-chairs, the Secretariat, and the Secretariat for the documents prepared on the basis of the results of the first part of the third session of the working group and for the organization of a number of webinars on the issue. They have proven to be very useful for the better understanding of this issue and defining further areas for discussion. On the basis of discussion held in recent years concerning DSI on genetic resources, we believe that this tasking and the attempt to develop a unified regulatory structure in this area has proven to be little realistic. Moreover, it could result in a detriment for the interests of some countries, which could potentially have a negative impact on further scientific research and the implementation of research results in practice. It's also hard to foresee how long a negotiating process on a unified approach would take. And this is an area where we witness fast developments that require regulation. We are facing the risk of getting involved in a protracted negotiating process with an uncertain result and be thus in a suspended conditions. Also, it could negatively impact negotiations in other areas. That is why we favor as a priority the option under which every country would develop its own legislative basis in the area, or legal basis in this area. At this session, we are for the concentration of our efforts on the development of documents that could be of an advisory nature, including voluntary guides or guidelines that states could use in developing their own national systems on the basis of unified approaches. The Russian Federation is open for a further in-depth discussion of this issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Russian Federation. Ecuador, followed by Switzerland. Ecuador.
Gracias, Co-Chair.
Thank you very much, Co-Chair. As regards the DSI subject and genetic resources, Ecuador would like to express its support for the statement that was made by Argentina when Argentina spoke on behalf of the GRULAC. And we'd like to note that for our country, it's important to reflect our vision of the intrinsic link that exists between genetic resources and their digital sequences. Moreover, recognizing their link with traditional knowledge, Ecuador supports the approach of a number of delegates from member states about the importance of having a comprehensive approach for DSI without this representing an obstacle standing in the way of the exchange of scientific information as well as the scientific and technical development, especially for developing countries. Finally, the idea being to increase the elements that make it possible for us to move forward in the overall management of DSI, we'd like to point out the importance of strengthening the mobilization of new financial resources, scientific cooperation, and the transfer of technology as fundamental pillars that make it possible to have a just and equitable distribution of the resources stemming from genetic resources in a framework of the respect of the DSIs. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ecuador. And I will give the floor to Switzerland, followed by Algeria.
Thank you, Co-Chair. Switzerland is of the view that the information summarized in document CBD-WG2020-3 add 1 contributes to our understanding of the topic of DSI, but it also reveals its complexity and highlights the need to carefully addressing this issue. In this regard, we fully support what has been indicated by Asia and the European Union. We also believe that we still need a better understanding of the options and their consequences before being able to move towards a decision. And I think the African group and several others have also highlighted that fact when indicating that we do not yet have a common understanding on the meaning of DSI. In this context, we think a position that we can only agree to a GBF if we have agreement on DSI seems to be quite inappropriate. We see the adoption of the GBF in the interest of each of us, not something that has to be balanced by progress in other areas. While we recognize the importance of DSI for the objectives of the CBD, we recall that there is no agreement on a benefit-sharing obligation for the use of DSI. With this in mind, we are of the view that the elements of a recommendation in document CBD-WG2020-3 add 1 contain some essential key points of potential convergence. namely the importance of open access to DSI in public databases, the role and rights of IPLCs, as well as the importance of capacity building. Let me also highlight some additional areas of convergence: the contribution to sustainable use and conservation of biodiversity, the support of research and innovation, legal clarity and certainty, a favorable cost-benefit ratio, efficiency, feasibility, practicability, as well as consistency with international rights and obligations. We will submit a longer statement with some concrete proposals to the draft recommendation, but most importantly, as said by Asia and the European Union, and as implicitly hinted at by Africa, before moving to conclusions, we need a better understanding of the basis, the policy options and their consequences. The steps outlined by the European Union may be a good way forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Switzerland. I'll now give the floor to Algeria, followed by Uganda. Algeria.
Thank you, Co-Chair. Algeria would like to stress on the fact that the DSI issue is extremely important for us, and therefore, Algeria supports the African position made by Namibia, and on this aspect, we hope that the parties will reach at a solution which is advantageous for all. Thank you.
Thank you, Algeria. And now I'll give the floor to Uganda, followed by Egypt. Uganda.
Thank you, Co-Chair. Uganda supports the statement made by Namibia, speaking on behalf of Africa. We also support the views of Cameroon, Malawi, Kenya, and other parties that have expressed concerns about the gaps in the text of the document on DSI before us. In the interest of time, Co-Chair, we will not read the full text of our intervention. Instead, we'll upload our statement on the CBD website. However, we wish to highlight the following two observations. One, we agree that DSI is intimately linked to the GBF and that our adoption of this framework is contingent upon disposing of all the unresolved issues on DSI. Second, we also support the proposal for a possible solution on this DSI with respect to benefit sharing concerns, a solution that calls for the creation of a global multilateral benefit sharing mechanism under the Convention, especially in the context of giving effect to the principles on fair and equitable sharing, free and open access to genetic data in public databases, IPLCs as main beneficiaries, capacity building, and technology transfer. We have some very specific amendments on the text of the recommendation for a draft decision, which we'll share with the group when we convene again. Thank you, Co-Chair.
Thank you. Dear delegates, I just want to pass on this information again and see how we move. The list of speakers, surely from parties, should now be closed. There are 22 of you. So if we can move from there, then I'll see how we handle the next. That is requesting for intervention from other governments, followed by observer organizations. So these are the countries, so that you prepare: Egypt, Argentina, Belarus, DR Congo, Israel, Tanzania, India, Bahrain, Ethiopia, Costa Rica, Togo, Peru, Philippines, Grenada, Serbia, Morocco, Bangladesh, Oman, Botswana, Burundi, China, and Burkina Faso. I wish to close the list really there. I'll now give the floor to Egypt, followed by Argentina.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Egypt supports the statement given by Namibia on behalf of Africa, as well as many, many African interventions that already made during this session. Mr. Chair, as everyone knows, Africa is a home for many genetic resources that have been used for many centuries and millennia, including Egypt, leading to huge traditional knowledge. However, when access standards was granted or approved in the Nagoya Protocol, there is no yet standards for benefit sharing. Tangible benefits are still restricted to few subjects, such as capacity building, technology transfer, and access to information on DSA. Mr. Chair, technological advances are being developed almost every day, and there are many countries that they are already benefiting from DSI, but this is not the case for developing countries. Transparency is urgently needed to close the wide gaps in views regarding DSI. Differences in views are happening even at the family level, when members of the same family inherit something from their mothers or father. This doesn't mean they have to wait for many years, as we did for DSI, which is already a subject already at the international community, including CBD decisions, whether in Mexico or in Egypt. We have enough information, Mr. Chairman, that help us to take appropriate recommendations. Stepwise approach and also options provided in the two documents are accepted to us, but should not stop us from taking appropriate recommendations that should link DSI with post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Thank you, Egypt. Argentina, followed by Belarus.
Gracias, señor presidente. En adición a lo expresado.
Thank you very much, Chair. In addition to what was stated in GRULAC, Argentina would like to make this statement as a state party. As a general principle, Argentina supports that the benefits derived from the use of DSI should be shared in a manner which is just and equitable, and that any approach or focus which is established to tackle DSI should not prevent access to DSI, nor should it stand in the way of scientific innovation. In order to be specific, as you have asked us to do, we're going to put 4 points forward. First of all, it is essential that the solution on the governance of the DSIs should contemplate something which is innovative and effective as a mechanism. We consider that the options of zero policy, status quo should be excluded from the needs to participate in the benefits are not acceptable for Argentina. Second point now, Argentina is encouraged by the possibility of hybrid solutions. This would lead to two possibilities. First of all, to follow a bilateral governance system to distribute benefits as a result of the use of DSIs, through which one could identify the origin of the genetic resource. On the other hand, we are thinking of a multilateral approach so that those cases where we are dealing with transborder resources, or for some justified reason, they cannot be, it is not possible to identify the origin of the resource from which the DSI was obtained. Third point, we believe that the discussion on the traceability of DSI about genetic resource from which they were generated or they stem from, we think it's extremely important. And for this reason, we would request that we should explore the mechanisms for traceability that could be developed for DSIs, together with other interested stakeholders, such as, for example, the administrators of databases, the main editorial staff of scientific journals, and scientific community in general. My fourth point now, we think it's important to determine the scope of DSIs, and in this sense we consider that groups 1, 2, and 3 have elements which should be included in DSA. And we also stress the importance of the elements contained in group 4, such as TK, traditional knowledge, or the information related to conditions of the management of genetic resources with environmental impacts. This is information that is absolutely relevant for the use of DSI and bioprospection. And Therefore, we believe that they are important elements that need to be considered in the solution which will be adopted to ensure the viability of DSI. In conclusion now, we reiterate our support for the step-by-step approach on the understanding that a decision on this topic will be adopted in the COP. And we shall be handing in our proposals in written form. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Argentina. And I'll give the floor to Belarus, followed by DR Congo. Belarus.
Спасибо. I thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. Many countries have been active researching sequences of genetic resources, have their own databases, have used these for research, diagnostic technologies development, for biodiversity conservation, agricultural production, food security, animal and human health, and LMO development. My country recognizes the importance of DSI, its huge contribution in mentioned areas, and the fact that DSI is an inherent part of genetic resources. At the same time, no international mechanism for DSI-connected relations exists, either for benefit sharing or biosecurity of specific sequences. For this reason, DSI must be included in the relevant parts of the GBF so as it can be fully implemented over the coming almost 30 years. We suggest that the contact group considers which would be the right chapters for this and how it can be done. We'd also like to thank the co-leads, the co-chairs Informal Advisory Group on DSI, the working group, the ad hoc group on DSI for their work to clarify working terminology and analyze possible DSI-connected regulatory mechanism, including benefit sharing. A global mechanism could become an important tool for solving divergences on DSI and benefiting access to it. Moreover, taking into account existing national legislation and regional regulation, as well as the difficulty of applying a unified approach to all sequences in the databases which have different levels of access. This question should be thoroughly considered at the next regular COP question in order to achieve progress. Taking into account the complex nature of the issue at hand, we believe that the co-chairs Informal Advisory Group on DSI should be continued as far as possible until Kunming, as proposed in document CBD-WG2020-3/4/Addendum 1, and we propose that our session's decision suggests to the COP that the group's mandate and that the mandate of the ad hoc group on DSI be extended so that we continue to discuss the various DSI issues after Kunming. We also support the initiative to discuss by the open-ended working group of the recommendations contained in document 3/4/Addendum 1, paragraph 24. Thank you.
Thank you, Belarus. I'll now give the floor to DR Congo, followed by Israel. DR Congo.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président, pour
I thank you, Mr. Chair, for giving me the floor. The Democratic Republic of Congo is fully in support of the statement made by Namibia on behalf of the African group concerning the DSI on genetic resources. This issue is not as fresh and new as one would believe. The conference in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, has given a lot of importance to this issue for the three objectives of the convention that are complementary. The DSI on genetic resources is an integral part of the convention as well as the Nagoya Protocol. If we do not include this issue in GBF, including the just and equitable benefit sharing, would mean a detriment for the substance and the integrity of both the Convention and the Nagoya Protocol. We cannot achieve ambitious goals by going down, by reducing them. from the start, we need the required resources. We couldn't deal with the elephant without its ivory. That's why it's very important to find a compromise on this issue. The efforts have been made during our virtual sessions, and we have to use the results to achieve compromise. Thank you.
Thank you, dear Congo. Now I give the floor to Israel, followed by Tanzania. Israel.
Thank you, Co-Chair. First of all, we would wish to thank the Ad Hoc Technical Expert Group on Digital Sequence Information for their hard work on establishing a basis for discussion on this complex issue. Israel shares the view of the European Union and many others that any balanced solution on DSI must not hinder current scientific research, nor establish cumbersome administrative procedures. Israel is very eager to see input into these discussions on DSI from diverse stakeholders, including scientists from academia, such as experts on wildlife DNA, and as well scientists and business leaders engaged in research and development in biotechnology field, especially molecular biological research for agriculture, innovation of drugs and medicines for veterinary use and human health. They have a veritable fountain of knowledge that must not be stymied, as it can add great depth and multiple benefits for all. We also have concerns in regard to the implications of imposing a new complex access and benefit regime under the Convention as proposed by Africa and others. Israel supports the European Union's position that stakeholders from the biotechnology sector must be included to a greater degree into these discussions on DSI, and we too wish to explore more options in a step-by-step approach. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Israel. Tanzania, followed by India.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Tanzania also aligns itself with the interventions as expressed by Namibia on behalf of Africa. Tanzania is a mega biodiverse country which attracts numerous users for commercial and non-commercial purposes, and therefore DSI is very important to us as far as access and benefit sharing is concerned. In this regard, global biodiversity framework without a clear and elaborate benefit mechanism will be added to the third objective of CBD and Nagoya Protocol.
They are on it. I think we're going back shortly.
English.
Hello, hello? English channel. This is a test, English channel.
Testing 1, 2, 3. This is the English booth. Testing 1, 2, 3.
Okay. Dear delegates, please take your seats again. I would like to read the list of speakers from parties. Somehow the system went off, but luckily enough we have written them down. So these are the speakers: Bahrain, Ethiopia, Costa Rica, Togo, Peru, Philippines, Grenada, Serbia, Morocco, Bangladesh, Oman, Botswana, Burundi, China, and Burkina Faso. So I'll now give the floor to Bahrain. The floor please to Bahrain.
شكرا سيد الرئيس. إن مملكة البحرين تود أن تؤكد على أهمية ما تضمنه بيان آسيا والمحيط الهادي، وفي هذا الإطار نود التنويه إلى ضرورة بلورة موقف عالمي يكفل الاستخدام المعلوماتي بشكل منظم وعملي.
Mr. Chairman, concerning this issue under discussion, DSI on genetic resources must have a solid and specific framework, which could be found in the report by the expert group, especially in favor of developing countries, so that we have an integrated global system which is balanced. Thank you.
Thank you, Bahrain. I now give the mic to Ethiopia.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. Ethiopia supports the statement made by Malawi on behalf of African region, including the amendment on the draft recommendation. Ethiopia believes that the regulation and benefit sharing resulting from the use of DSI on genetic resource should be shared fairly and equitably to implement the third objective of the CBD. Ethiopia is in support of the view that any approach or modality or mechanism that is intended to address DSI should not hinder scientific research and innovation. Further, Ethiopia would like to remind that appropriate capacity development programs or initiatives should be in place to sufficiently and effectively use and address issues of DSI. And there should also be a clear recommendation on tangible modalities of benefit sharing that arises from the use of DSI on genetic resources. Nationally, Ethiopia put in place ABS legislative framework that regulate genetic resource and associated traditional knowledge. And the CBD should have to acknowledge those domestic measures applicable to DSI. Ethiopia considers that DSI is an integral and intrinsic part of genetic resources defined under the CBD. The issue of DSI should be addressed not only under the Nagoya Protocol, but also under the CBD and on the post-2020 GBF. And finally, my delegation believes that the significance of passport data in traceability of DSI on genetic resource should be meaningful when benefit sharing is taken into consideration. Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair.
Thank you. Ethiopia, Costa Rica, followed by Togo. Costa Rica.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. Costa Rica supports the GRULAC statement on DSI. We think that digital sequence information should be treated as part of genetic resources. And also, we believe in the advancement of research and development of DSI. For this reason, its access could be open, but not completely free, but under clear and agreed ABS rules. Moreover, we support further studies of policy options, especially multilateral system, and in some cases, the bilateral or hybrid options. Furthermore, it's important to continue capacity building and technology transfer on DSI to developing countries, as well as to arrive at an agreed definition of DSI. Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair.
Thank you. Costa Rica, now I give the floor to Togo, followed by Peru.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je vais être un peu...
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll be very brief. According to the logic of Namibia's statement on behalf of Africa, Mr. Chair, I would like to recall that the framework we all want should be inclusive, taking into account the concerns of all the parties and all the stakeholders. That's why I hope that all of us are united in the importance of reflecting the role of the indigenous peoples, the local communities, the women and youth, and so on. This depends on the incentives that would be called for in the framework concerning DSI on genetic resources, with all the additional initiatives at the national levels to implement the framework. In this process, we should note that the problems in this area are pending and strong measures are needed to take in an urgent way. And this way, in the coming decades, we would go ahead with the implementation of the 3 objectives of the Convention, including 3J. Thank you.
Thank you, Togo. Peru, followed by Philippines. Peru, you have the microphone.
Muchas gracias.
Chair, thank you very much for giving me the floor. We support the statement by Argentina on behalf of GRULAC. Peru, as a mega-diverse country with centers of genetic diversification origin, would like to stress the following, that the benefits stemming from the use of DSI should contribute to the conservation and use of genetic resources of countries which are origins of the resources which include DSA. International mechanisms with mutual support are needed to ensure that the benefits will come from the DSI, which comes from genetic resources, bearing in mind also the importance of the participation of indigenous peoples and local communities as key elements for the conservation and sustainable use of biological diversity. And for this reason, it is important to consider their roles and their rights when dealing with or tackling the issue of DSI. Moreover, our delegation believes that it is really crucial for the use of DSI that it should take into account the prior fundamental knowledge and mutually agreed conditions. And lastly, we believe that a traceability system is needed that makes it possible to identify the countries of origin of the DSI and the ways in which they are being used. I thank you.
Thank you, Peru. I'll now give the microphone to Philippines, followed by Grenada. Philippines.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. The Philippines believes that the discussion on DSI should focus first on determining whether this issue is within the scope of the Convention. Advancing the discussion on how DSI should be subjected to the regulations and provisions of access and benefit sharing may result into the development and adoption of unwanted restrictions and barriers to the utilization of the information. Although the Philippines supports the notion of benefiting from its own resources, inclusion of DSI into the deliberations of the Convention may disenfranchise the researchers of the country and the advancement of science and technology in the country. In that case, a Philippine research institution where most are strapped with tight budget, the inclusion of DSI into the Convention and the Nagoya Protocol can make research projects unaffordable due to the additional and complex requirements that will be introduced. In this case, researchers may focus away from conducting research projects using DSI. Thus, the Philippines underscores the importance of mobilization of resources, scaling up capacity building efforts, and opportunities on national, sub-regional, and regional levels, in addition to global processes. Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair.
Thank you, Philippines. I'll now give the floor to Grenada, followed by Serbia and Morocco. Grenada, you have the... Mic to Grenada, please.
Could we give the mic to Grenada, please?
Grenada supports the statement made by Argentina on behalf of GRULAC and thanks the Secretariat and the work on the Informal Advisory Group. In addition, we would highlight 3 key points quickly. First, we see DSI as an integral part of the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. Secondly, mechanisms need to be set up to support benefit sharing, both financial and non-financial, reaching local communities for stewardship and sustainable local action. Thirdly, continued capacity building is urgently needed, and technology transfer, especially for the development of local value chains and local value-added products, needs to be set up. Islands are sources of new and novel species, so a stepwise process to guide resolution on use of DSI, genetic resources, and associated traditional knowledge is urgent and key for conservation, for wise use, in addition to the 3rd pillar of the Convention, the equitable access and benefit sharing. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Grenada. Serbia, followed by Morocco. Serbia.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. Serbia, as many parties today, call for finding a balanced and step-by-step solution on DSI. DSI plays an important role in identification, characterization, and evaluation of genetic resources as an important step towards conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. These days, we can hear a number of considerations on how DSI may affect the objectives of the Convention and Nagoya Protocol, since the information does not contain functional units of heredity or genes as required by definition of genetic material. The access to information is not equivalent to access to genetic resources, and as it is given in the CBD and the Nagoya Protocol. Based on that, we believe it is necessary to establish a balanced solution on DSI, taking into account the following: to maximize advancement of the objectives of the CBD, to minimize impact on research and development related to genetic resources, to avoid additional implementation challenges, both for developed and developing countries by including DSI in the scope of the Nagoya Protocol, to avoid restrictions to access to DSI, to avoid harmful effects on research supporting conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity and the objectives on the Convention and Nagoya Protocol, and also to avoid creation of additional bureaucratic procedures and excessive burdens to research and development, which would delay scientific progress and innovation, and to minimize a negative effects on achievements of the SDGs caused by application of ABS obligation to DSI. The CBD and Nagoya Protocol are characterized by bilateral approach which cannot adequately address DSI. The specific nature on DSI, together with the easy availability and transmission of this information, weighs in favor of multilateral solution by introduction of a new global mechanism. Such an approach would ensure that the system would respond to the needs of expected beneficiaries and allow the international community to understand and respond to the different communities involved, in particular IPLCs, including by addressing the needs of scientific community. Thank you.
Thank you, Sabia. I'll now give the microphone to Morocco, followed by Bangladesh. Morocco.
Thank you very much, Chair. I will be extremely brief because a number of parties who have spoken before me have actually set forth in a very significant way the essence behind the reasons that encourage us to better approach this topic, which is incredibly complex, how difficult it is to find a modus operandi that fits well within the spirit of the third goal of the Convention on Biological Diversity and the related protocol. Morocco, I should say, supports the essence or substance of the statement which was made by Namibia when Namibia spoke on behalf of the African group. Morocco would like to highlight that the availability of DSI from a given genetic resource with a given user could, in some cases, make it absolutely unnecessary to resort to access to the physical genetic resource from the original provider. Morocco would like to stress that it's very important to have an international agreed approach. It must also be effective on the issue of DSI. And we consider that any approach that would deal with DSI should not prevent access to information on digital sequences nor should it stand in the way or in a significant way of scientific research and innovation. I thank you.
Thank you, Morocco. I will now give the floor to Bangladesh, followed by Oman. Bangladesh.
Thank you, Co-Chair. Bangladesh supports the statement made by Sri Lanka on behalf of Asia and Pacific groups and all other parties who are on the same page on the issue of regulating DSI, on the issue of genetic resources. Yet, my delegation would like to add that Bangladesh is one of the few countries enacted Bangladesh Biological Diversity Act 2017 that covers the issues of ABS related to genetic resources, including the derivatives of biological products to be considered under the regime of ABS. Mr. Chair, Bangladesh would like to adhere importance on coming up with a clear guidance to the COP to regulate the matter of DSI in the perspective of the capacity of the developing and least developed countries. My delegation would like to focus on resource mobilization towards achieving the technical and technological capacity towards ensuring a level playing field for all the parties involved as a provider of and accessor to genetic resources and user of DSI of genetic resources, and thus strengthening the fair and equitable sharing of benefits. Thank you, Co-Chair. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bangladesh. I'll now give the floor to Oman, followed by Botswana and Burundi. But Oman, you have the floor.
شكرا السيد الرئيس المشارك. بالنسبة لموضوع معلومات
Thank you very much, Chair. As regards DSI, the delegation of the Sultanate of Oman would like to begin by thanking parties concerned for the efforts made up until now, in particular the report of the Informal group and its co-chairs. And so we support what Sri Lanka said on behalf of Asia and the Pacific on this subject. The delegation of my country would like to stress how essential it is to consider this in the framework of additional discussions in order to come up with a position that would fit within the post-2020 framework appropriately. Taking into account the needs and interests of all stakeholders, we have to take into account the just and equitable sharing of the benefits in the area of DSI, and this requires the capacity building in developing countries and also ensuring the necessary technology transfer to these countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Oman. These are now our last four speakers from parties: Botswana, Burundi, China, and Burkina Faso. Botswana.
Thank you, Chair. Botswana is of the firm view that digital sequencing is a result of utilization of genetic resources and or at best the subsequent application of a genetic resource in line with Article 5.1 of the Nagoya Protocol. On this understanding, Botswana shares similar position made by Namibia on behalf of Africa and the like-minded countries that benefits accruing from the utilization of DSI should be shared fairly and equitably in line with the requirements of the Nagoya Protocol and CBD, hence should form an integral part of the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Botswana. Burundi, followed by China.
Merci, Monsieur le Co-Président. Le Burundi soutient la...
Thank you very much, Chair. Burundi supports the position of the Africa Group that was presented by Namibia on digital sequencing. We support the capacity building for parties on on DSI and adequate financing of states parties, in particular developing countries for a better knowledge, better understanding, and better decisions that can be made on the access and sharing of the benefits of the use of DSI. Thank you.
Thank you, Burundi. I give the floor to China, and lastly will be to Burkina Faso. China.
谢谢主席，感谢有关代表团和。
Thank you. China would like to thank the delegates and the co-chair for their messages of condolences after the accident, which has made us extremely sad. The President of China has already reacted. The government of China immediately started the emergency and rescue operations. On the issue of DSI, we would like parties to be able to find a balanced solution and a way to resolve the problem. Thank you very much.
Thank you, China. Burkina Faso.
Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Chair. As several countries have said, my country, Burkina Faso, recognizes the importance of access and equal sharing of the benefits of digital sequencing, and this is why Burkina Faso supports fully the statement made by Namibia on behalf of the African group. Given that we are the last ones to take the floor, practically many of what we wanted to say has already been said by others. We're therefore going to upload our comments on the website of the CBD. However, we would like to make sure that there is equitable use of DSA, favoring research and innovation. The adoption of measures which are comprehensive and inclusive by various parties is also a wish I'd like to express on behalf of my country, so that at the next COP a decision will be taken along these lines. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, Burkina Faso. Dear delegates, that now brings us to the end of the interventions from parties. We will now open the floor to other governments and followed by other organizations. We shall begin with the major groups when we go to the other organizations. So I now give the microphone to other governments. USA, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. As a mega-diverse country that is a major provider and user of genetic resources as well as genetic sequence data, the United States recognizes the critical importance of developing common understanding and finding a practical and pragmatic solution for DSI. We need to be exceedingly thoughtful in considering policy options for DSI, and we would caution that approaches that limit the flow and use of information could create challenges for scientific cooperation and capacity building, and could potentially jeopardize the generation and sharing of benefits. We stress that any approach to DSI should promote and allow access to genetic sequence data in public databases, encourage the use of such data, and enable a more equitable distribution of the broader benefits that come from access to and use of data, and also identify workable models for monetary benefit sharing. Regarding the process going forward, we support a stepwise approach to develop a shared understanding of principles for DSI that can be used to develop policy options. As others have said, we think it will be important to engage a broader set of stakeholders, including academia, industry, and public databases in the work going forward. This will be important especially for assessing the feasibility of options that would require their action or involvement. In considering modalities, there is a need to consider how policy options for addressing DSI will interface with other instruments and existing national access and benefit sharing regimes that apply to information to avoid creating overlapping, duplicative, or conflicting obligations. Thank you.
Thank you, USA. Now we shall go to observer organizations. Of course, we are going to begin with the major groups, IPLCs, ICC, or business in that case, academia and research, youth, and women.
2 minutes.
So we are giving you 2 minutes, but that does not mean that you cause problems for interpreters. Please try to move as carefully as you can so that it is, of course, we have taken a little bit of time past lunch time, so the energy level can be low on everyone. Now let me give the floor to IPLCs.
Thank you, co-chairs. I'm speaking on behalf of the IIFB. Hereditary material is sacred to indigenous peoples and local communities. It is alive with the life force, life essence, or living spirit that connects all living things to a living cosmos and Mother Earth. Life essence infuses all beings and entities, human and non-human, in a web of interconnected relationships. Life essence infusing genetic material is understood as forms of kinship rather than merely inert sequences of crystalline amino acid monomers found in DNA and RNA. This spiritual and reciprocal relationship enabled biological and genetic diversity to thrive in our lands, territories, and waters. With this guardianship, we would not have the diversity of life that is the source of genetic resources and genetic sequence data. The elements of a draft recommendation should be more ambitious and bring us closer to a clear decision at COP15 that DSI falls within the scope of the third objective of the convention. For genetic resources and associated TK of IPLCs, falling within the bilateral system and transboundary situations, there needs to be free, prior, and informed consent. For those situations where genetic resources are widespread, where FPIC is not possible, where sources cannot be localized or the results of historical appropriation and movement of GRs, we need a firm commitment to ensure benefit sharing for all uses of genetic resources and DSI through a multilateral benefit sharing system to fill gaps. We propose adding few textual changes, biocultural and genetic diversity in para 5C, and we'd also like to add including through licensing terms and with their free, full and effective participation in para 6B, and we ask for party support at this time. Thank you, co-chairs.
IPLCs, I hope you've managed to conclude. That is now the new method. Instead of me telling you stop. Once you hear it, I tell you. So thank you very much. Please upload your statements so that we can capture any other parts that you might have not said it. I'll now give the floor to Academia and Research, microphone 254, followed by Business, microphone 252. So Academia and Research.
Thank you, Chair. My name is Dr. Amber Hartman-Schultz, and I represent the DSI Scientific Network, which brings together 54 DSI experts from 21 countries on 6 continents. The lens of science looks rationally at arguments on both sides and offers a balanced perspective. Our open letter, signed by 23 international research organizations and over 700 scientists in just 2 weeks, has 3 messages. Number 1, we have to acknowledge the inefficiencies of current ABS systems. DSI is far more complex than genetic resources and thus requires a simple, standardized solution. Number 2, and forgive the technical term, but DSI is mumbo-jumbo in isolation. That means it must be compared to billions of other DSI in order to be understood. The GR used to produce these DSI come from every corner of the planet, and this scientific fact, in our view, requires a multilateral policy solution. Number 3, researchers need open access to DSI, as emphasized by Africa, Asia Pacific, Brazil, Canada, Japan, Guatemala, the Philippines, and USA. Open access can support benefit sharing and even be harnessed to create a positive feedback loop, which we don't often see in ABS circles. We also support interventions from Asia Pacific, European Union, and Israel that the scientific perspective be included in the informal advisory group process. And finally, a plug, the network has a concrete technical ideas on DSI capacity building, which we invite everyone to hear during our side event on Wednesday. Thank you.
Thank you, Academia and Research. I'll now give the microphone to 252, followed by NGO 246.
Thank you, Chair. I'm speaking on behalf of ICC, which has members with a lot of experience in generating and using DSI in various sectors to create value. We would like to share some comments to support a fact and experience-based debate and to help parties find a path forward while maintaining its previous positions. Experience has shown that the current approach to implementing ABS is hindering rather than advancing the achievement of all three goals of the Convention, including the third pillar. We therefore strongly urge parties to consider a broader assessment and review of how ABS is implemented today and not to further expand this approach to cover DSI. We understand the reasoning behind the proposed multi-criteria analysis methodology, but would like to highlight the following points. There are still fundamental divergences among parties and stakeholders on many issues relating to DSI, including a lack of common understanding of the scope and definition of DSI. Without agreement on such basic issues, there is no firm foundation for an effective analysis of the options proposed. Given the importance of ensuring that any system is efficient and brings in substantially more benefits than it costs, a cost-effectiveness analysis is an essential step before proceeding to select or eliminate options. While the multi-criteria framework may have been chosen because of the inability to quantify the likely impact of different options, it will lead to decisions that may be based merely on assumptions. We would also like to stress the importance of integrating the experience and perspectives of potential users from both the private and public sector at each stage of the process, as expressed by several parties. With respect to criteria, open access and exchange of DSI in the public domain is particularly essential to facilitate research, innovation, and scientific cooperation, as are legal clarity
Academia.
and certainty for implementation.
Sorry,
technical-
business, you seem to be taken up by...
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, so I'll stop.
Yeah, so, but please do give us your submission, upload it.
Thank you.
Lastly, the floor to NGO 246.
Thank you, Co-Chair. I'm from the Third World Network. I will be brief and pick up on one point in para 5B of the document. Much of the sequence information generated is placed in so-called open access databases that are in reality a free-for-all for corporations or directly placed in private data banks. Yet the vast majority of benefits are already accruing to only a few, perpetuating profound inequities. Look no further than the inequitable access of the developing world to COVID vaccines. It is clear that no solution to DSI will only jeopardize the GBF, not only jeopardizes the GBF, but also the Convention itself and its principle of fair and equitable benefit sharing for the utilization of genetic resources. The issue must be urgently addressed. If not now, then when? Developed countries will of course have national approaches to DSI, particularly where it's possible to track and trace, and this must respect IPLC rights as well. Bilateral approaches can be complemented by a multilateral benefit sharing mechanism with implementation of benefit sharing terms and conditions by databases on their users, maintaining access for researchers, but with benefits paid into an international fund. Such a fund should also support IPLCs, including for the development of their own knowledge systems for biodiversity conservation and sustainable use. Thank you, and I look forward to party support.
Thank you, Third World Network. Dear delegates, before we come to the conclusion of this session, okay, let me give the floor to microphone 825. Academia. Academia.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. I speak on behalf of the Public Research and Regulatory Initiative. Mr. Co-Chair, readily and freely available digital sequence information is crucial for the public research to support the objectives of the Convention the implementation of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, as well as the Sustainable Development Goals. Topic of current discussion is whether and how DSI is to be addressed under the access and benefit sharing provisions of the Convention and the Nagoya Protocol on Access and Benefit Sharing. This has become a prolonged discussion that is creating counterproductive uncertainty for research for the common good. PRRI proposes that, at a minimum, the parties agree that if DSI is to be included under the national systems and or under the Nagoya Protocol or any multilateral system that may be under discussion, it must not hamper public research, it must facilitate and support innovation by the public sector, and it must promote and support research that contributes to the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity and the Sustainable Development Goals. Finally, PRRI remains available to provide scientific contribution to the further deliberations on this topic. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, academia and research. Before we go to the concluded part of this session, we had a statement and some proposal from IPLCs. Apologies, we forgot to request for support for that. So we'd like to request now if there could be a party supporting the, I see support, thank you so much. So dear delegates, we have now heard your thoughts and reflections about the addendum document and its elements of a recommendation. It is clear that more work is needed on this item. So we would like to invite Contact Group 5, which was established during the first part of our meeting, to continue its work under this agenda item. Ms. Letitia of South Africa and Mr. Gaut from Norway will continue to serve as co-leads of this contact group. The group will work on a non-paper to be prepared on the basis of the views you have expressed today concerning the draft recommendation in the addendum document. The first meeting for the contact group 5 will be held on Wednesday, 23rd March from 3 p.m. to 6 p.m. The second meeting of the contact group will be held on Thursday, 24th March from 3 p.m. to 6 p.m. Dear delegates, we have not been able to handle all that we had planned to do today, especially the stock take. And now that we are going to do it, as we told you earlier in the opening, that we are planning to have a joint stock take with the other chairs of Substar and SBI. So you'll be informed during the course of the week when that will be done. And before we can close, let me now invite the Secretariat for some announcement.
Thank you, Co-Chair. We would like to remind delegates, especially those that have made any textual changes on this agenda item, to upload your statements during the lunch hours, so within the next 2 hours. We really would appreciate if you could upload your statements within the next 2 hours. Also, just as a reminder, working group, contact group 3 will meet at 3 p.m. today in this room. And in the evening, we will have 2 contact groups, one on Substar agenda item 3, the second on SBI agenda item 6, and they will take place at 7:30 p.m. today. Thank you. Thank you, Co-Chair.
Thank you, Secretariat. Dear delegates, this meeting is now closed.